The dust clung to Silas Thorne like a second skin. It was late afternoon, and the sun beat down on his small ranch outside of Promise Creek, Montana. For 6 months, the only constant had been the wind and the silence. He was a man of the earth, his hands calloused from years of tending to the land, his face weathered by the relentless elements. Silas had lived a solitary life since his father passed, the only company being his loyal dog, a half-blind mutt named Ranger. But all that was supposed to change today. Today, the stagecoach was bringing his future. He stood on the porch, a letter clutched in his hand. It was from a woman in Ohio, a seamstress named Elara Albright. She was a distant acquaintance of his late mother, and through a series of earnest, careful letters, they had arranged a mail-order marriage. He didn't expect love at first sight, just a companion to share the burdens and joys of a life he felt was too big for one man. A faint rumble in the distance grew into the familiar grinding clatter of the stagecoach. Silas's heart, a thing he rarely noticed, gave a slow, deliberate thump against his ribs. The stagecoach pulled to a stop in a cloud of dust that momentarily obscured the world. The driver, a gruff man named Gus, jumped down and opened the door. "Got a delivery for you, Silas," Gus grunted, his eyes twinkling with a knowing look. Silas stepped forward, his gaze fixed on the open door. A small figure emerged, but it wasn't the sturdy, older woman he had imagined. Instead, a young woman, perhaps barely 20, stepped out, clutching a small valise. Her dress was a pale, travel-worn blue, and her dark hair was a mess of wisps around a face that was a mix of exhaustion and panic. She looked at the ranch house, then at Silas, her wide eyes reflecting a profound sense of being utterly out of place. He didn't speak. He couldn't. The carefully constructed image of his future shattered into a million pieces. "You're Mr. Thorne?" she asked, her voice a soft, tremulous sound against the wind. Silas nodded, his jaw tight. "Where's Elara Albright?" The girl bit her lip, her gaze dropping to her worn leather boots. "She's my aunt, sir. Her name is Clara. She got very sick right before we were supposed to leave. A fever. The doctor said she couldn't travel. She was so upset, but the ticket was paid for and we couldn't get the money back. She didn't want to disappoint you, so she insisted I come. I'm Elara Albright." The name fell like a stone in the heavy silence. Silas stared at her, the words, "I came by accident instead of my aunt," echoing in his mind. He looked at her delicate hands, her slight frame, and the terror in her eyes. He had ordered a woman to be his wife, a partner. He got a frightened girl who looked like she belonged in a library, not on a dusty, isolated homestead. A wave of frustration, sharp and bitter, washed over him. Gus cleared his throat, sensing the tension. "Well, I'll be on my way then. Got a schedule to keep." He winked at Elara. "Don't you worry, miss. Silas is a good man." As the stagecoach rumbled away, the silence returned, thicker and more oppressive than before. Elara stood there, her valise by her feet, looking up at Silas. He finally found his voice, a low rumble from deep in his chest. "Do you still want a bride?" she asked again, her voice barely a whisper, a plea more than a question. Silas looked at the woman who was not his bride, and the future he had planned was gone. He was left with an uncertainty he didn't know how to face. The first few days were a study in strained silence and awkward proximity. Silas had little experience with anything besides the land and the animals. He didn't know how to comfort a person, much less a young woman who was stranded in a place she clearly feared. He showed Elara to the small, separate cabin that had been his father's. "You can stay here, for now," he'd said, his words measured and distant. Elara tried to be useful. She attempted to cook, but the results were disastrous. The bread was as hard as a rock and the beans were scorched. Silas ate them without a word, his expression unreadable. She saw the truth in his eyes. He didn't want her there. She was a reminder of a failed hope. Elara, for her part, was overwhelmed. The vast, empty landscape of Montana was nothing like the bustling green Ohio she knew. The loneliness was a physical weight, but her pride and her aunt's desperate belief in this arrangement kept her from breaking down completely. She spent her days trying to make sense of her new surroundings, wandering the small plot of land, watching Silas from a distance. One afternoon, Silas was working on a fence post, his powerful arms swinging the hammer with practiced ease. He seemed to be part of the landscape, a natural extension of the rugged terrain. Elara, sitting on the porch, watched him, her mind turning. She knew she couldn't just sit and wait. She had to try. She walked over to him, her heart pounding. "Mr. Thorne?" Silas paused, wiping the sweat from his brow with the back of his hand. "Silas." "Silas," she corrected herself. "Is there anything I can do to help? I know I'm not a farm girl, but I can learn." He looked at her small hands, so different from his own, and a flicker of something, maybe pity, maybe a grudging respect, crossed his face. "You can sort the firewood," he said finally, pointing to a large pile of logs. "Just don't get splinters." It was a simple task, but Elara attacked it with a fierce determination. She sorted the logs by size, stacking them neatly. Her hands were sore, and a few small cuts appeared, but she felt a small sense of accomplishment. That evening, as they ate in silence, Silas looked at the neatly stacked woodpile outside. A small, almost imperceptible nod was all he gave her, but it was enough. It was the first sign that she wasn't just a burden. Later, as she sat on her porch under the vast, star-filled sky, a tear slipped down her cheek. She was terrified and lonely, but for the first time a sliver of hope found its way into her heart. She wasn't just Elara Albright, the girl who came by mistake. She was becoming Elara, a woman trying to find her place in a harsh, beautiful land. The days settled into a quiet, almost domestic rhythm. Elara found her footing. She discovered she had a natural aptitude for mending and stitching, and she spent hours fixing Silas's worn clothes and patching up his bedrolls. She also learned to make a passable stew. Silas, in turn, began to open up, albeit slowly. He would tell her about the land, the seasons, and the history of the ranch that had been in his family for generations. The conversations were brief and practical, but they were a bridge across the chasm of their initial meeting. One morning, Silas was preparing to take a wagon into town for supplies. "Need to get some grain and a new axle for the old cart," he said, checking the harness on the horses. "You'll be all right here?" Elara nodded. "I'll be fine. I'll get the stew ready for when you return." He rode out, the wagon rumbling behind him. A few hours later, Elara was gathering vegetables from the garden when she heard a loud crack, followed by a series of bangs. Her heart leaped into her throat. She ran toward the sound and saw Silas's wagon, lopsided and still, about a mile down the road. He was on foot, walking back toward the house, his expression grim. She met him halfway. "What happened?" "The axle broke. The one I was going to replace," he said, a note of bitter irony in his voice. "I can't fix it out there. The new one is in town." He looked defeated. "I'll have to walk to Promise Creek. It'll be dark by the time I get there, and even later when I get back with help." Elara's mind raced. "Wait, what's the problem with it? Can you show me?" Silas looked at her skeptically, but led her back to the wagon. The wooden axle was completely snapped in two. "It's firewood now," he said, kicking a piece of it with his boot. "No, wait," Elara said, kneeling down. Her father had been a carpenter. She'd spent her childhood watching him work, listening to him talk about the grain of the wood and the strength of joints. "The break is clean. If we can get a strong piece of wood, a young oak maybe, we can use some metal strapping to hold it together. It'll be temporary, but it could get us to town." Silas stared at her. He hadn't considered it. He'd only seen the finality of the break. He watched as she took a length of rope from the wagon and began to tie the pieces of the broken axle together. Her knowledge of knots and wood surprised him. Together, they found a suitable sapling, and with Silas's axe, they shaped it to fit. Using what metal straps they had, they created a makeshift brace. It was far from perfect, but it held. By the time the sun began to set, they were back on the ranch, the wagon creaking and groaning, but whole. Silas had never seen anyone so determined to solve a problem he had already given up on. He looked at her, truly looked at her, and saw not a fragile girl, but a resourceful and intelligent woman. "You saved me a long walk," he said, his voice softer than she had ever heard it. Elara smiled, a genuine, joyful smile that lit up her entire face. "It's what partners do, isn't it?" The word hung in the air, a silent, powerful question. It was the first time she had used it, and the first time he had truly considered it. The incident with the wagon axle had changed things. The tension between them had dissolved, replaced by a comfortable, easy companionship. They talked more, not just about the ranch, but about their lives, their dreams, and their fears. Elara learned about Silas's quiet hopes for a family and a future. Silas learned about Elara's desire for a life with purpose and meaning, something more than the mundane existence she'd had in Ohio. Their growing closeness did not go unnoticed. Promise Creek was a small town, and gossip traveled faster than the stagecoach. Silas was a respected but private man. Elara's presence was a curiosity, but not everyone was a well-wisher. Jedediah Stone was a man of greed and entitlement. He ran the biggest cattle operation in the county and had a long-standing grudge against Silas. Jedediah wanted Silas's land. It was prime grazing territory, and he'd been trying to buy it for years. Now, with a woman on the ranch, Jedediah saw a new angle, a new weakness. He rode out one afternoon, his 2 sons in tow, and found Elara working in the vegetable garden. Silas was out mending a fence on the far side of the property. "Well, now look what we have here," Jedediah drawled, his voice a mocking sneer. "Heard Silas got himself a wife. Didn't figure her to be so small." He dismounted, his eyes sweeping over her with a predatory gaze that made Elara's skin crawl. "I'm his guest," Elara said, her voice trembling slightly but holding firm. "Guest, are you? Looks more like a little bird in a hawk's nest," he laughed, a harsh, unpleasant sound. "Silas ain't much for company. Might be he's getting soft. And a man gets soft, his land gets weak." He took a step closer. "Maybe you'd be better off with a real man, little lady, someone who knows how to treat you right." Just then, Ranger, Silas's dog, emerged from the barn, a low growl rumbling in his chest. A moment later, Silas appeared, his stride purposeful and his face a mask of granite. "Jedediah," Silas's voice was low and dangerous, "what are you doing on my land?" Jedediah feigned innocence. "Just paying a visit, Silas. Seeing how you and your little friend are getting along." Silas stepped in front of Elara, shielding her from Jedediah's view. "We're doing just fine, and you're done with your visit." Jedediah's smile vanished. "You got a temper, Silas. Might get you into trouble. And when trouble comes looking, it's the little things that get broken first." He shot a final, menacing glance at Elara before mounting his horse and riding off. Silas didn't move until they were gone. He turned to Elara, his eyes filled with a protective fury. "Are you all right?" She nodded, but her hands were shaking. "Who was that?" "A man who thinks he can have what he wants, no matter who he hurts to get it," Silas said, his gaze hard. "Don't you worry about him. He won't bother you again." But the words rang hollow. Elara knew she had become a target. Silas had stood up for her, but the threat had not disappeared. It had simply gone from a distant possibility to a very real, very present danger. The encounter with Jedediah only cemented the bond between Silas and Elara. It was no longer about a mistake or a temporary arrangement. It was about shared defiance in the face of a common threat. The fear lingered, but it was overshadowed by a burgeoning affection. Elara had a new sense of purpose. She began helping Silas with the ranch's ledger. She had a knack for numbers and a meticulous eye for detail. She found several discrepancies that had gone unnoticed for years, including a series of small, suspicious payments to a man named Jedediah Stone for right-of-way fees on the Thorne land. It was a thinly veiled attempt at extortion, and Elara's discovery infuriated Silas. "He's been bleeding me dry with this nonsense," Silas said, his face red with anger. "I'll take this to the sheriff." "No," Elara said, her hand on his arm. "Not yet. We need proof, not just a suspicion. Let's document everything, every payment, every date. He won't be able to deny it then." Her calm, logical approach was a stark contrast to his usual impulsive nature. It was in that moment that he realized she wasn't just a partner in work. She was a partner in life. That evening, as they sat on the porch, a quiet contentment settled between them. The air was cool, and the crickets hummed a gentle symphony. Silas felt a peacefulness he hadn't known in years. "My aunt, she wrote to me," Elara said, breaking the silence. "The letter came with the supply wagon today. She's getting better. She says she's sorry for the trouble she's caused." "She didn't cause any trouble," Silas said, his gaze fixed on the horizon. He turned to look at her, a rare, gentle smile on his lips. "She gave me a better future than I ever could have imagined." Elara's heart fluttered. She felt a blush rise to her cheeks. The air was thick with unspoken emotions. "Elara," he began, his voice low and serious, "I know this isn't what you planned, and I know I'm not who you expected, but I don't want you to leave, not when your aunt gets better. I want you to stay, as my wife, for real." The question hung in the air. It wasn't a proposal born of convenience, but of genuine feeling. It was a leap of faith for a man who had never taken one before. Elara looked at him, at his kind eyes and the hopeful vulnerability on his face. She knew her answer without a second of hesitation. "Yes, Silas," she whispered, tears of joy welling in her eyes. "More than anything." He reached out and took her hand, his calloused fingers wrapping around hers. The moment was simple, honest, and more real than any fantasy she had ever held. The next day, Elara and Silas rode into Promise Creek. They had a purpose: to show the sheriff the evidence of Jedediah's deceit. The town seemed different now, a place of shared experience rather than isolation. They waved to the local blacksmith, exchanged pleasantries with the store owner, and felt the warm, knowing smiles of the townsfolk. It was as if their bond and their defiance was a beacon. At the sheriff's office, Sheriff Miller listened patiently as they laid out the ledgers and the documented payments. He was a good man, but a cautious one. "This is good work, Silas, but it's not enough to get an indictment. Jedediah's got friends on the council." "So what do we do?" Silas asked, his frustration growing. "We wait," the sheriff said. "We watch him. He's greedy. He'll make a mistake." Dejected, they walked out into the dusty street. As they were about to head to the general store, they saw Jedediah across the street. He was talking to a man named Harlan, a man who worked for the railroad. Jedediah's eyes met Silas's, and a sneer twisted his face. "Don't worry," Silas said to Elara, wrapping an arm around her shoulders. "We'll get him eventually." Suddenly, Jedediah and Harlan began to walk toward them. Elara's heart pounded. She saw the gleam in Jedediah's eye, a cold, cruel glint of triumph. "Look at this," Jedediah said, stopping in front of them. "Silas and his little lady, all lovey-dovey. Too bad she's a tramp." Silas's arm tensed around Elara. "Watch your mouth, Jedediah." Jedediah smirked. "She's the one who lied to you, Silas. She never came here by mistake. That old Aunt Clara of hers. She's not a seamstress. She was in a debtor's prison. And Elara, she saw your advertisement and came on purpose. She's a fraud, Silas, a con artist who wanted a way out of her life in Ohio." Silas's blood ran cold. He looked at Elara, her face pale, tears welling in her eyes. He had been so blinded by his new love, he hadn't considered a different truth. He hadn't asked enough questions. "Is that true?" Silas asked, his voice low, his arm dropping from her shoulders. Elara couldn't speak. The shock of being discovered, of having a past she had desperately tried to bury, laid bare for all to see, was paralyzing. Jedediah pressed his advantage. "She came for your land, Silas. She just wanted a life of ease. She never cared about you." "Leave us alone," Silas said, his voice a tight rasp. He took Elara by the arm and pulled her away toward their wagon. As they rode back to the ranch, a heavy silence settled between them, a silence far more painful than the one from their first days. Elara knew what Silas was thinking. He had opened his heart, and he felt betrayed. "Silas, I can explain," she began, but he cut her off. "Later, Elara, not now." His voice was cold and distant. The man who had looked at her with such love and hope now looked at her with doubt and hurt. The truth, in Jedediah's vicious hands, was a weapon that had struck its target. The air on the ranch was thick with tension. Silas and Elara moved around each other like strangers. He worked on the land with a grim focus, his jaw set and his mind replaying Jedediah's words. She tried to approach him to explain, but his cold silence was a wall she couldn't penetrate. The peace they had found was gone, replaced by suspicion and heartbreak. Jedediah, having sown the seeds of distrust, moved in for the kill. He had paid Harlan from the railroad to intercept a letter from Silas. It was the return address he wanted. He wanted to confirm where Elara had come from so he could show Silas the proof and drive a permanent wedge between them. But he was impatient. He decided to take matters into his own hands. He needed to get rid of Silas permanently. Jedediah and his 2 sons rode out to Silas's ranch under the cover of night. They moved silently, their purpose cold and malevolent, but they made one mistake. Silas wasn't in his bed. Unable to sleep, he was out in the barn, mending a saddle. Elara heard the dogs begin to bark furiously, a different kind of bark, not a warning, but a desperate alarm. She ran to the window and saw 3 shadows on horseback outside the barn. She saw a flash of a lantern inside and knew Silas was in danger. She had to do something. She grabbed a shotgun from the closet, her hands trembling. Her father had taught her to handle one, just in case. She ran out of the cabin and toward the barn, her heart in her throat. Jedediah and his sons had cornered Silas inside. Jedediah had a pistol drawn. "This is for the land, Silas," he hissed, "and for that little liar you took in. She won't be needing a man to live off now." Silas's hand was on his belt, near his holstered revolver, but Jedediah's sons were blocking the way out. Just then, Elara burst through the barn door, the shotgun raised. "Get off his land!" she yelled, her voice a mix of terror and determination. Jedediah turned, a surprised, scornful look on his face. "Well, look at that. The little songbird has a shotgun. You think you can use that?" Elara's finger tightened on the trigger. She didn't want to hurt anyone, but she couldn't let them hurt Silas. As Jedediah advanced, Silas saw his chance. He drew his revolver, but one of Jedediah's sons tackled him, knocking the gun from his hand. Seeing Silas in danger, Elara fired. The blast was deafening. The shot hit the barn wall, showering Jedediah's sons with splinters and dust. The sound alone was enough to make the horses whinny in panic. The 3 men, startled by the unexpected resistance from the fragile woman, hesitated. That was all the time Silas needed. He fought off the son, grabbed a pitchfork, and advanced on Jedediah. "Get off my land or I'll bury you on it," he roared. The rage was a palpable thing. Jedediah, realizing the element of surprise was lost, and they were facing an enraged man and a determined woman, knew they were outnumbered and outmatched. He ordered his sons to retreat, and they galloped off into the night. The silence that followed was broken only by their ragged breathing. Silas looked at Elara, her hands still shaking, the shotgun lowered. The man, who had been so full of doubt just an hour ago, was now looking at her with an overwhelming mix of relief, awe, and a deep, profound shame. Elara dropped the shotgun, her knees buckling. Silas was by her side in an instant, holding her, his arms wrapped tightly around her. "You saved me, Elara. You saved me." She just sobbed into his chest, the fear finally giving way to exhaustion and emotion. He led her back into the house, got her a glass of water, and sat with her by the fire. The silence wasn't cold anymore. It was a space for healing. "Jedediah was right," Elara finally said, her voice small. "About my aunt. She was in debt, not prison, but close to it. We lost our home. We were destitute. My family had no one else to turn to. Your advertisement came at a time when we had no other options." She took a deep breath. "My aunt told me about a woman from our old town who had made a good life for herself as a mail-order bride. It seemed like the only way out. She wrote to you as a last resort." She looked up at him, her eyes pleading for understanding. "When she got sick, she begged me to come in her place. She said you seemed like a good man, and that if I could make you believe I was her, maybe I could convince you to marry me and give us both a life. I didn't know what else to do. I was terrified." It was a desperate lie, Silas. Silas listened to her, his face a mix of pain and understanding. He saw the genuine remorse, the weight of the secret she had carried. He thought of all the moments they had shared, the jokes, the fears, the laughter. They were all real. The foundation of their relationship wasn't a lie. It was a desperate beginning that had turned into something true. "Elara," he said, his voice soft, "I believe you, and it doesn't matter. Not anymore. I asked you to be my wife because I fell in love with you. Not the woman I thought you were, but the woman you are. The one who fixed a wagon axle, who made a home out of an empty house, who stood up to a man with a gun to save my life." He took her hand. "Jedediah was a fool. He thought a lie could break us. He didn't realize that our truth is stronger than anything he could ever say." Elara's shoulders slumped. The burden of her secret finally lifted. She looked at him and saw not a man who was hurt by deceit, but a man who was ready to forgive and to love. "And you were right," Silas said, a ghost of a smile on his face. "You saved my life, and I owe you for it." Elara's own smile returned. "It's what partners do, isn't it?" The past was behind them, and the future, though uncertain, was theirs to build together. The next morning, with the sun washing the ranch in a soft, golden light, Elara and Silas rode into Promise Creek. They went straight to Sheriff Miller's office. This time, Silas's posture was different. He was no longer dejected. He was determined. He recounted the events of the night before, how Jedediah and his sons had come to his property with a clear intent to harm him. He told the sheriff that Elara, with her brave action, had saved his life. He also confessed his own doubts, how Jedediah had used Elara's past against them, and how it was almost enough to break them apart. The sheriff listened, his expression grim. "Jedediah went too far. I can't ignore this. And I've received a few other complaints about his son's behavior. We'll get him this time." Just then, Jedediah and his sons rode into town. They walked down the main street, brazen and arrogant, until they saw Silas and Elara talking to the sheriff. They began to laugh, a taunting, hollow sound. Jedediah stopped in front of the sheriff's office. "Looks like Silas is crying to the sheriff again. Can't handle the truth, Silas. That little girl of yours is nothing but a liar." Silas's gaze was steady and unwavering. "I know her truth, Jedediah, and it's a lot more honest than your lies. You came to my house last night. You tried to murder me, and I have a witness." He put his hand on Elara's back. "She was there, and she'll testify to everything." Jedediah's bravado cracked. The truth spoken aloud was a powerful thing. He saw the townspeople beginning to gather, their faces a mixture of curiosity and distrust. Silas was well liked. Jedediah was not. "That's a lie!" Jedediah snarled, but his voice was thin. Sheriff Miller stepped out onto the porch. "Jedediah Stone, I'm placing you under arrest for attempted murder, and I'll be having a word with your sons as well. It's over." Jedediah looked at Silas, his eyes filled with a cold, impotent fury. He was cornered. His land, his reputation, everything he had used his power to build was about to crumble. He was led away, his reign of terror over, not with a blaze of glory, but with the quiet dignity of justice. As they walked away from the scene, Elara looked at Silas, her heart full. He had stood up for her. He had defended her honor in front of the entire town. She knew then that she had a home, not just in a place, but in a person. The weeks that followed were a testament to the strength of their new beginning. With Jedediah and his family gone, life on the Thorne Ranch settled into a peaceful, productive rhythm. The fear was gone, replaced by a deep sense of security and belonging. Silas and Elara worked side by side, their movements synchronized by a quiet understanding. He taught her how to ride a horse, and she taught him how to bake bread that wasn't as hard as a rock. They built a life not based on expectations, but on a shared reality. One quiet evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple, they sat on the porch, holding hands. The air was cool and filled with the scent of pine and fresh earth. "I wrote to my aunt again," Elara said. "I told her everything, about Jedediah, about the lie I told, and about how you loved me anyway. I told her that she was right. You are a good man, Silas." Silas squeezed her hand. "What did she say?" "She said she always knew I was stronger than I gave myself credit for," Elara said, a smile gracing her lips. "And she said she was happy for me. She told me she and the family are doing better, and that she's finally out of debt and on her feet again. She said there's nothing to hold us back now. The last remnants of the past were finally gone." Their story had not been one of a lonely man meeting his perfect bride. It had been one of two people, both lost in their own way, finding a home in each other. Silas looked at his ranch, at the fields of grain, at the sturdy fences he and Elara had mended together. The land wasn't just his anymore. It was theirs. "Elara," he said, turning to face her, "you didn't come by accident. You came by fate, and you brought a life to this place that it hadn't had in a long time." He leaned in and kissed her, a tender promise of a future filled with love, not just for a moment, but for all the chapters to come. And under the vast, silent Montana sky, their story was just beginning.